Lines. What's cracking, everybody? Today, with the preseason already having started and the regular season just around the corner, you know what that means. It's time for some wild speculation and guessing at lines. Now, this video I think we will be keeping a little bit on the shorter end as, well, for one, again, it's all pretty much speculation at this point, and for another, once we get deeper into the preseason, and certainly once we get into the regular season, all of this will either be proven wrong or right either way and will be somewhat irrelevant. So let's just get to looking at what I at least think the lines for the Seattle Kraken will be, at least to start out the season. Now, of course, especially with the Kraken and especially last year, the lines changed up quite a bit, even game to game, and it took until a good way into the season before there were even two lines that were somewhat consistent game to game. So whether or not that stays the same, or if they start this season a little bit more how like they ended it with at least 2 to 3 fairly consistent lines, only time will tell. Either way, even if this is how they start the season, I would imagine it isn't how they finish it. Still, what the heck, let's have some fun. So we might as well jump right into it. And of course, we're going to start with the first line, which actually might be the most predictable of the lines for the Kraken, where it seems pretty much like a lock at this point that Matty Beniers will be the center and Jordan Eberle will be on the right wing. And it also seems fairly likely that the left wing would be Andrei Burakovsky. Really, the only, I guess, couple of question marks here, and they're not super significant ones, would be one, there still is maybe a chance that they decide to ease Beniers in a little bit rather than having him start as the first line center of his rookie season, or in his rookie season, and they start him a little bit lower down the lineup, and then maybe Jared McCann steps into that first line center role for a little bit. But I don't think that's super likely. It seems like Beniers is on track to be that first line center. So then the other question mark potentially would be if they want to ease him in a little bit by giving him a couple of guys he's a little bit more familiar with. Of course, that's part of the reason I already have Eberle on the right wing, because Beniers played with him in those 10 games when he was up at the end of last season. They could decide to put Donato back on that left wing, again, being the fact that they had played together even before last season, and then, of course, had those games and some decent chemistry between them in those last few games of last year. But ultimately, I still think it's much more likely that Burakovsky ends up on that left wing. I mean, for one thing, that's why you went out and got him in the first place. Plus, again, they do actually have a real regular season and training camp and practices to get to know each other and learn how to play together, unlike last season where it was significantly hampered by COVID. Moving on then to the second line, this is where things do start to get a little bit harder to predict and more interesting, in that I guess it's interesting because they're harder to predict, but anyway, from here on down, to me, the big thing that a lot of this depends on is whether or not the Kraken decide that Shane Wright is ready to come to the NHL right away to start out the season. It's sounding like he's had a pretty good training camp so far, and if things continue on that trajectory for the rest of the preseason, he very well may be starting with the team. And since I'm hopeful that that's going to be the case, that's what we're going to roll with. Still, though, the second line, if there is still a question mark, I don't know that Wright will be starting at that second line center right away and getting those bigger minutes. Instead, I think it's most likely that Alex Wennberg will be centering that second line, and on either side of him, we have Oliver Bjorkstrand, who's really only on the second line because, again, I think Eberle being with Beniers to have a little bit more of a familiar face is the most likely outcome there. And then on the left wing, we have Jared McCann. Now, I know you might be thinking, Wennberg didn't have the greatest start to last season, and well, sure, he did have a pretty good finish to it, so did Gord, and Gord actually played well pretty much the entire season, so why wouldn't Gord be on this second line? Ultimately, that comes down to the fact that Gord does play a little bit better at both ends, and Wennberg does have a bit more of an offensive upside than Gord when he's actually able to show it. Granted, that isn't quite as consistent as Gord, but still, I do think Wennberg fits a little bit better on that scoring line type of role, or at least the best the Kraken can do for a second scoring line anyway. And not that Gord wouldn't fit well there as well. Again, he can play pretty well on the offensive end, as we've seen. Again, it comes maybe a little bit more down to the fact that I think Gord fits better in that third line type of role, the more shut down line, or at least irritate and make life hard for the top six of the opposing team. So then with the third line, as I've already said, I think it's Gord there at center, and then on either side of him, I have gone maybe a little bit out on a limb here, But I think Tanev fits on one of those wings. Maybe not right at the start of the season. I don't know if there's any chance that they're going to want to ease Tanev in and make sure that that knee's ready for NHL action. They'll probably figure that out during the preseason. So I would think that Tanev gets there. Again, another one of these guys that's very good at checking, can make life hard, at least along the boards, for an opposing team. And certainly when it comes to jumping on any mistakes that another team might make, with him and Gord on the same line, well, we saw early on in the season that the two of them could work pretty good together at doing that already. And we saw Gord continue that as the season went along, plus with Tanev's straight line speed, they could make some exciting things happen. Okay, now maybe having Tanev and Gord on the same line isn't the craziest thinking in the world, but I have been seeing Tanev a lot more on the fourth line for where most people have been putting him than starting out the season on the third. Still, it's at least what I would like to see, even if it isn't necessarily the way that's most likely the Kraken go. Still not that far outside of the box, but when it comes to who I have on the right wing here on this third line, that might be a little bit more unlikely even than Tanev. Still, it's probably what I would do, and it comes mostly down to having a little bit of that chemistry from the end of last season carry over into this one. And this is where I have Carson Coleman, and again, it has pretty much to do with how well he and Gord played together to end that last year, and trying to get a little bit of that to continue into this one. Of course, when they were playing together, they were a little bit more in that second line type of role and trying to get some points, but again, I think that the two of them working well together, Coolman being kind of a utility type player, they can make it work. And sure, it might not be the most bruising third line in the NHL, but it could still irritate some teams and get under people's skin along the boards at the very least. And that just leaves the fourth line, which, as long as guys can stay healthy, and this is at least close to how things pan out, probably will end up being one of the better fourth lines, at least on paper, that the NHL has to offer. Of course, that's balanced out by the fact that the top end for the Kraken, by comparison across the league, is one of the weaker ones. But still, the Kraken are one of these teams that's much more even across the board on the forward end, rather than having the high-end talent at the top and then making up for it salary-wise towards the bottom. Either way, the center on this one, if he's going to make the NHL roster to start things out, is Shane Wright. And again, if he starts the season, could very quickly move his way up the lineup and end up in that second center role by the end of the season if all goes as well as we would like it to. But for at least the start of the season, they probably ease him in a little bit, and putting him on a fourth line where they can shelter his minutes wouldn't hurt. So then when it comes to that, if you're going to put him on that fourth line to get him some NHL experience and not make things too hard on him, having a couple of veterans like Schwartz and Donskoy on either side certainly wouldn't hurt things. Now, Donskoy is coming off of, well, not the best season of his career when it comes to points production, and he certainly looks like it was, let's just say it looked like it was getting to him towards the end of the year. He started to kind of let his play slip a bit, and that's part of why I think he starts things off here on the fourth line. And if things continue to devolve for him, then he could find himself out of the lineup and some other guys stepping up into that role as the season goes along. I really like Donskoy, so I certainly hope that that doesn't happen, and he can have a bounce-back season like a couple of other players, especially ones in net for the Kraken. But time will only tell, and either way, he is pretty talented and can make some plays happen, and alongside Wright, it could be a fun duo to watch. And of course, Schwartz is the veteran rock of that trio, and the question there is just whether or not he can stay healthy for a full season. Of course, if this does turn out to be the lineup that the Kraken go with to start out the season, for one thing, if I got all 12 of these players right in their correct positions on the correct lines, probably have to go buy a few lottery tickets, but aside from that, it also means there's going to be a few guys, regardless of whether or not I get it right, that will probably see some playing time throughout the season that won't be starting out as starters in that first day. And here, that would mean that Ryan Donato, Morgan Geekie, and Cole Lynn all would not be starting, well as a couple of other guys, but those are the three most notable ones, at least from players we saw last year. Donato probably being the one that we would expect to see the most playing time, and Geekie not far behind him. Which could also leave the question of, if Shane Wright doesn't start out the season with the Kraken, who moves up into this lineup? And if they wanted to keep the wings the way that I have them, then that would pretty obviously be Morgan Geekie that would move up into that fourth line center role. And if they wanted to maybe mix things up a little bit more and put the guys that played the best last year for the team, then it probably means McCann moving into a center role, probably the second line center, Wenberg then dropping down to maybe fourth line center, and Donato moving up onto one of the wings, specifically the left wing, obviously. And I guess to be even more specific, the fourth line left wing is where I think he would fit in, with Schwartz then moving up to that second line left wing with McCann as the center, and again, still Bjorkstrand as the right wing. Moving over then to the defensive side of things, it is a little bit more clear-cut here who, well, at least 5 of the 6 starters are going to be, and seems somewhat clear where those guys are going to fit into the lineup. Especially on the left side of things, where the first left defenseman, I think, is pretty obviously Vince Dunn. And then on the right, I could see it going either way. Most people have that being Larson. But I personally think that Schultz probably fits there better with Dunn. Who knows, it could still be Larson just because he's familiar with the team, and they could change that later on in the season depending on how things are going. Either way, that means Alexiak is the second pair left defenseman, and then you have the other one of Schultz or Larson. Here, for me, it's Larson on that second pair. And then third pair, again, left side pretty obvious, it'll be Soucy there. And then on the right, that leaves Will Borgen. Of course, the one thing that could change this all up is if Riker Evans ends up making the team to start out the season, which seems like it could be a decent possibility by what we're hearing. If that happens, then you have probably Soucy move over to the right side so that Riker Evans, who plays on the left, can move up into that third left spot. Borgen then would be the spare. Outside of Evans, though, I really don't see too many other players in the defensive system depth for the Kraken challenging Borgen for that 6th spot on the defensive end, at least to start out the season. Sure, there are probably going to be injuries, and there's always a chance that Borgen doesn't quite impress enough, and maybe a guy moves up from the AHL level. That's maybe where maybe a Cale Fleury could come up. But again, I think Evans is the only real potential guy that could step up into that 6th spot. And finally, in goal, as everyone already knows, it's Grubauer's the starter and Martin Jones is the backup. There's really nothing all that interesting going on here, at least not until Drieger comes back from injury in late February, mid-March, probably March is more likely. And by then, who knows what else has changed. Okay, I mean, I guess there still are special teams as well, and when it comes to at least the power play, the first power play unit I think is probably going to look pretty similar to what they rolled out at the start of training camp, which was Wenberg as the guy up front in front of the net, then the 3 guys across the ice, also forwards being Burakovsky, Bjorkstrand, and Beniers, the 3B line, which obviously with Bjorkstrand and Burakovsky coming over to the Kraken in large part because of their power play experience and ability to help there, makes a lot of sense that they'd put them on the first power play unit. And again, Beniers makes a lot of sense as the third one there. And then quarterbacking it as the lone defenseman would be Justin Schultz. Again, similar story there. Part of the reason, or large part of the reason, he's the guy that they signed is because of that power play quarterbacking experience. And of course, that probably would mean Dunn then would quarterback the second power play unit. And as far as the 4 forwards are concerned, you're probably looking at some combination and some arrangement of Schwartz, Eberle, McCann, and Gord, with Shane Wright mixing in at some point in the season, assuming, again, he's playing with the team. But with that having been said, I think we will try to bring this one to an end. I'd love to know your thoughts on the lines that I had here, what I did just absolutely crazily wrong in your eyes, or maybe I got everything right, or what lines you would put for the Kraken to start out this season. Either way, again, we'll probably get a better idea as this preseason goes along, and regardless of what the lineup looks like on the first couple games of the season, it'll probably look pretty different by the end of the first month or 2. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel, so I'd appreciate you using them. And until next time, which is going to be pretty soon as the season's getting pretty close, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken.